Welcome again to another Startup Grind. If you're not familiar with what Startup Grind is, it is a global organization dedicated to connecting, educating, and inspiring entrepreneurs. Tonight, we are doing a fireside chat that's sort of on the educating and inspiring piece of that mission. Tonight, our guest is Matt Wyckhouse. And Matt, did I pronounce your name the right way, the last name, or no?
It's Wyckhouse, but you were
Oh
close. That's
no,
okay.
Wyckhouse. Okay, that Y just threw me off, man.
You're not the only
Yeah,
one. Don't worry. Yeah.
yeah. So he is the founder and CEO of Finite State, and if you're not familiar with them, they are a cybersecurity company, which we'll get into a little bit more here in a bit. I think you've raised something like $19.5 million to solve problems in that space, and we're really excited to dig in a little bit to that story. Thank you for coming. How are you doing, man?
Thanks for having me. Definitely excited to be here, and I'm good. It's the start of a new week in our journey. It's been an interesting one. Lots of
Yeah.
things going on in the world today that are pretty relevant to what we do.
Yeah. So, and maybe it's an interesting starting point, because I want to talk a little bit about your story and the starting of the company and stuff. But just since you brought it up, there are some really interesting things happening and some unfortunate things happening in the news in terms of organizations and companies getting hacked. There's a company called FireEye in your space, which I guess they got hacked. And as this is unfolding, how has that sort of impacted you and like the operations on your end? Has it impacted operations, or just, I guess, what is your reaction to all the stuff that's going on in the news with us getting hacked, this Treasury Department and all that?
This is probably a pretty, I would call it a watershed level of event that happened and has been divulged over the weekend. Not just because of the fact that it was a major hack. We've experienced as a country, as a world, major hacks. I mean, the U.S. federal government had all of their personnel records stolen, through OPM, and we've had several major insurance companies hacked, and there have been major physical attacks and hacks on critical infrastructure, all of that. What's unique about this one, as I think if you're watching the news, you're seeing, well, all of a sudden the FireEye was hacked, and then the Department of Commerce was hacked, and then the Treasury was hacked, and now DHS was hacked, and now this other company was hacked. Well, how are all of these companies all getting hacked at the same time? And it's because it's actually very, very central to what we do. It's what's called a supply chain attack. And it means that the software, a product that all of those organizations bought was attacked, it was compromised, and then they installed that product on their networks, and that allowed the attackers in. It's a Trojan horse, basically. And that's where we, at Finite State, spend a lot of our time is looking at supply chain attacks. That's why we exist.
Yeah.
And so it's a really interesting example of that, a really, really bad one. This is a very serious situation that's been happening. It goes back to about March of this year when the Russian hackers were able to make their way into this company called SolarWinds that everyone uses for managing their networks. And so all of those customers started experiencing these issues. It wasn't detected for a very long time, and really until it looks like FireEye noticed the activity. Now everyone is starting to see that they were victims of this as well.
Yeah, it's super, super interesting. And, when things pop up like this in the news, at least on my end, I tend to have this bias that, well, this is something that could never happen to me personally. I try to be secure. I use two-factor authentication and VPNs and stuff like that. But I guess from your perspective, what do you think for an average individual the risk is for some type of attack like this? Like how much risk do you see that in the supply chain?
So you're probably gonna be surprised by my answer, but it's very little for an individual.
Okay.
These are what we're talking about is it's kind of two different ball games here. That's in the news right now is we're talking about Russian intelligence services targeting the federal government in the US to collect intelligence. And we're talking about them getting into Fortune 500 companies and like maybe critical infrastructure providers. That's very serious stuff. And they spend a lot of resources trying to do that. Countries around the world, it's called signals intelligence. The US government hacks other people, other countries hack us. That's part of espionage. It happens all the time. Lots of money goes into it for various strategic purposes. That's what we're talking about here. This is a big, complicated event that's probably well funded. For an individual, when you think about supply chain security, you're probably thinking more about the security of your devices. And for your Internet of Things devices, if you have a Ring doorbell or you have a camera in your house or a smart TV or something like that. All of those are computers. They have software inside of them. We call it firmware. They're on your network, and it's possible that those devices could be compromised. When you think about supply chain issues with those devices, we're probably talking more about a vulnerability that some attacker who happens to be scanning the internet might see on your network and opportunistically go after. It's still a generally low risk issue for most consumers. What we see in IoT security that tends to be like a higher risk for people at home are potential privacy issues. You might not know that device is recording you and uploading it to their servers. Samsung had a big problem with this with their smart TVs. If you go back, 5+ years ago, where it turns out that it was listening to everything all the time, even if you didn't have the TV on. So we care about those sorts of issues in your home. We do care about supply chain security issues. If there was, let's say, a major, if this actor group, which is what we call the adversaries we have, if this actor group had gone after somehow made their way into an iPhone instead of into SolarWinds, that would be a really big deal for everyone because they could pick and choose individual people that they would want to target. But we haven't seen that necessarily in the consumer space. And so it's less of a concern for individuals, more of a concern for businesses. And that's where we spend a lot of our time is with bigger organizations, especially like in the energy sector and critical infrastructure.
Gotcha. So I think it might be helpful. I think we all kind of have an intuitive sense of being safe and having cybersecurity put in place. But for people who aren't super familiar with what Finite State does that is sort of different or unique, would you mind just telling us a little bit about your approach to this problem?
Yeah. So Finite State, first of all, we were founded a little over 3 years ago, and we are a VC-backed company. As you say, we have Drive Capital here locally as an investor who led our first round, and we have a few other investors, Zetta Venture Partners and Energy Impact Partners, and a couple others. And our main purpose has been in trying to identify these sorts of supply chain attacks, and really more comprehensively than that, vulnerabilities that can be introduced in the supply chain. So our focus is looking at all of the devices that are not a traditional computer. So you can call it Internet of Things. In some places, we call it operational technology. In other places, we call it industrial control systems or Internet of Medical Things. There's a lot of different names for it. But if you look at networks at large right now, there are actually more devices on networks that are you could call IoT, Internet of Things, than there are traditional PCs and even smartphones. And so we focus on that because each one of those devices has software in it. And just like your computer that needs to be updated because there are vulnerabilities in it, or your phone, these devices need to be properly managed. They need to, the vulnerabilities need to be identified in them, and they need to be protected, because what's most interesting, what's most ironic about cybersecurity is those little devices. You might not think about it in your home, but when you look at a business, when you look at a utility, when you look at a power plant or a city infrastructure, those are the devices that are controlling the most critical things, and thus, they need to have the most scrutiny. And so we look at what we call the firmware for those devices, and we try to figure out what sort of risks might be in there. Is someone trying to actively, gain access to that device through the supply chain? Are there major vulnerabilities that need to be patched inside of those devices? That's where we spend all of our time, and we do that working both with the manufacturers of those devices to make sure that they can build secure products, and with the people that are using those devices, so they know if the products that they're using on their network are secure or not.
Gotcha. It's interesting. So it sounds like it's such a complex problem to solve. And I want to kind of go back to start where this kind of began. And one of the first things that I noticed about you was you were a computer scientist at Battelle, and then you made this sort of leap into being the CTO of their cybersecurity unit. And I was just hoping maybe you could tell us a little bit about, like, how does one go from that to that, and how did you kind of find yourself in that position?
I'd love to be able to say, I had, amazing skills, and that propelled me several layers up inside of Battelle, with one swift movement. But that's not the reality. Some of it was being at the right place at the right time. So, first of all, my experience at Battelle, it's a really cool place. If you don't know it, it's unique, probably in the world. It's a nonprofit research and development company. They've been around for 90 years, I think, at this point. They were created by the will of a man named Gordon Battelle to better mankind through science and education. Really, really unique. But I started there as an intern when I was going to school at Ohio State, and worked as a computer scientist pretty quickly. And my career at Battelle was 13 years long, so I stayed on for a while because I liked it. And I was working on a lot of different software projects, and eventually moved into what we would call signals intelligence, where we were looking at different communications, looking at devices, and trying to help our intelligence community understand what was happening in those signals. And eventually I moved into what we would now call, cyber network exploitation, or computer network exploitation, where we were trying to find ways to get into and achieve intelligence objectives against their adversaries, get into their networks, get into their devices, and collect intelligence. So I was effectively, along with a team of people, reverse engineering and finding vulnerabilities in different systems. And at that time, as we started, doing some really good work for the government, the board of directors at Battelle said, we want, we're on boards that these other companies, everyone has a cyber division. Why doesn't Battelle have a cyber division? And eventually they said, let's do that. Let's create a new business. And they asked who at Battelle knew about this cyber thing that the board was talking about, and they pointed at me, and they said, okay, great. You're going to be the technical lead for this new business, and we're going to pair you up with a business unit manager. And I had no idea what they were talking about, building a business. I was an engineer or scientist at the time. They sent me to a week-long business boot camp, and then we ran a 100-day startup program basically from there. I learned a lot really quickly, and then we were off to the races. And effectively, we created a little startup inside of a 90-year-old company that was pretty well funded. We started with about 20 people, and by the time I left, it was a little shy of 200 people. So that was over about a 5 to 6 year period at Battelle. And in that time, we did some really, really great work supporting global operations for our intelligence community. While there, we were able to do a lot of really interesting work. And so one of the things, besides the offensive cyber stuff that we were doing, one of the things that I got to work on was leading some efforts in supply chain security for hardware. So we were looking for things like counterfeit electronic components or hardware that actually had been backdoored in the supply chain that could make its way into, let's say, a weapon system. You don't want to, or a satellite. You don't want a satellite to go up where we have a chip inside of it that someone had actually put some malicious hardware in there. And so we got to do some really interesting work there and found some very interesting things in that process.
And I apologize if I'm cutting off an answer now, but I was going to ask you, sort of having been on both sides of, the innovation inside of a company versus doing your own startup, how would you compare those two experiences? Is it harder or easier? What are your thoughts on the difference between those two things?
It's hard to say if one is harder or easier than the other. I can say that corporate innovation, starting up a business unit instead of a large business, is you're walking a tightrope with a safety net underneath you. Likely if you fall off, you're going to be caught. Now they could decide that they're done with the experiment and fire everyone, I suppose. But we knew that wasn't going to happen, and we had a lot more. Probably had more money than most startups would have access to, because there's a very clear business case they wanted to invest. It was inside of a multi-billion-dollar company, so we definitely had a safety net, and it wasn't the scrappy startup experience that you would expect outside. Now the downside is that every day that goes by when you're in a corporate innovation team and you're trying to start a new thing, you're going to feel the pull to be like the rest of the business. And eventually, or quickly in some cases, they're going to be asking you what your P&L statement looks like for this new startup. And you're going to say, well, no, we're in a J curve. We're supposed to be losing money for the next couple of years until we come out of startup mode. And they'll say, yeah, that sounded good a couple months ago, but maybe we'd like you to get up to that above the line here pretty quickly as economic pressure comes in. So that's the challenge with corporate innovation, is it's always that pull to get back into the core engine of the business and generate profitability faster than you might like to. Some companies probably do it really well. I would say Battelle, when we were there, we felt that pretty quickly because we happened to do it right as we were going into a pretty major recession. And especially there were a lot of issues with government funding at the time. So there was, we had to shorten the cycle on some things that we were trying to do. Out in autonomous startup land, you don't have that pull, but you also don't have that support. And so you need to be scrappier. You need to chart your own course in a different way. I think you have a lot more freedom, but you have a lot more consequence. And if you fall off the tightrope, you die, and there's no safety net anymore. And so it's just different. I wouldn't say one is better than the other, but I can say I learned a lot from my time at Battelle, and I think it set me up well for my time at Finite State.
I want to know more about your decision process to start a company and what sort of that experience was like at the time, because you're now like what is it, like 3 years into it. At what point did you decide, all right, I'm going to start something, and what made you feel, I guess, okay with taking that path?
Yeah, I think, eventually at my time at Battelle started feeling like we were kind of moving back into the main core of the business. And um, I knew from my experience starting the business that I liked the starting part a lot more than I liked operating the large company part. And so I think eventually some of the large company politics and just the you know some of the necessary bureaucracy that exists in big companies started to frustrate me. It's not unique to Patel. It's just unique to, or it's just the way it is in large companies. Those systems are there for a reason. And so I knew I wanted to probably get back into something that felt like a startup. And so what I did was I actually joined another startup for about a year. I had spent my whole career in government contracting and inside of one company, and so I wanted to see what it was like in a small company again. And so I joined a small startup called Redacted and spent a year there with a lot of other people that had backgrounds like me that they came out of NSA or CIA or other places and were joining a startup for the first time. And it was a very, very good environment, very interesting experience. But then I also realized that I wanted to learn what it was like to be in a startup, because it just became clearer and clearer that I wanted to run my own. And I had this passion around solving this supply chain security or IoT security problem. And so I was putting a lot of work into that other startup, and it wasn't exactly what I wanted to be doing. And so I said, I decided that it was time to look into starting my own company. I wanted to get back with some of the people that I had worked with at Battelle that I had brought up, for years and years, who I knew were world-class experts on this problem. And I was lucky enough to know some, drive capital from my time at Battelle and after Battelle, just relationships that I had there, and went to them and said, they had been kind of asking and teasing me and saying, when are you going to start a company? When are you going to start a company? And I walked in one day and said, all right, I'm ready. Let's do this. Here's what I want to do. And so, we worked, talked it over, and eventually started Finite State.
So as you were making this transition, I mean, were you ever uncertain about that direction? I mean, how confident were you going in when you decided to create a company?
I mean, there was tons of uncertainty. There is going up, I'll say pitching for the first time, to investors is a really nerve-wracking experience. You have a lot on the line, especially when you're pitching something that you're so passionate about. And maybe the answer is no, and then you've got to go pitch another investor and another investor, or maybe it's defeating to the point that you don't want to do it anymore. So there is certainly a lot of anxiety around it. It's a big deal. Jumping, you kind of have to just jump off the edge a little bit and be willing to do that. Now, that being said, I also was lucky. There are a lot of people that go down the bootstrap path and they have to give up their salary for a long period of time, and they don't get a large investment round to start with, which we were lucky to be able to do. And so it's everyone I think has a different experience. Every entrepreneur does, and we have our own that I think we were pretty lucky to have really supportive investors from the outset. But it's not that it was without anxiety. There's a lot when you decide that you want to go chart your own course, and that's what we did.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. I feel like everybody kind of that does start something great has to have that sort of dialogue in their head about the risk, and especially when you're passionate about something, is it good enough, is it not? I guess so. One of the additional things that's kind of interesting is, so this company's been around for like 3 years, and one of the things that has at least been said about it is that to a certain extent it was in stealth mode for a while. How do you make a decision around like being in quote unquote stealth mode, and what does that actually look like? Because I could imagine while you're in stealth mode, you're like, no, we're a company, we're supposed to be out in the world and pitching and growing and all that sort of stuff. But what was that time like for you?
Um,
Is that accurate?
reflecting back, I'm going to give you kind of a snarky answer,
Okay.
because it's the truth. It means that we had enough money that we didn't need customers to get started, and that's not necessarily a good thing. I will also say it's a different thing. There's different ways to approach building a business. We knew that we had a very technology heavy problem to solve. It was expensive and it's hard to solve. Cybersecurity, when you look at a lot of startups, you're trying to go find a customer problem that you fit with really well. And often, and it might be as simple as like automating a process that someone's doing manually, or it might, in B2C companies, it's about giving users an experience that they like, and trying to get engagement really, really quickly. In cybersecurity, you know what the problem is. Everyone knows what the problem is. People don't want to get hacked. Like that's it. Whether that hack is coming from the supply chain or coming from insiders or phishing attacks or whatever, you can segment it down. But the bottom line is people don't want to get hacked. They don't want to lose money. They don't want, the lights to go off. That's the problem. The hard part about cybersecurity startups is having a solution for that that's going to work, having the technology to be able to do that, or the expertise to be able to do that. And that's expensive. And so, the approach that we took was to raise a lot of money up front so that we could build the foundation of that technology and then start taking it to market. Now, if I were to do it again, I would probably do it a little bit differently.
How so?
I would have customers engaged earlier, even if we were embarrassed by the technology. And when you're doing there are different types of startups, and some of them fall into this category where you have to perform some critical function, and it gets really hard to offer a minimum viable product to a cybersecurity team, because if you're wrong, if they're depending on you and you're wrong, like there are serious repercussions to that. So there's a lot of fear around putting an MVP in their hands. But you have to kind of get over it, and you have to figure out how to explain it to them and how to find the right customers who are willing to work with an early stage company, even on a critical problem. And usually that only happens if they don't have another way to solve it. And then you realize that, well, they're not going to be completely dependent on you, and you can try new things and you can work together to come up with better solutions faster if you're engaged with a customer than if you're trying to do it on your own. And so I would have engaged earlier with customers than what we did. I wouldn't say that we went terribly off track or anything, but you can be a little complacent when you have too much money to start with.
That's super interesting, and you kind of answered my next question, which was, was the original thing that was pitched what the company is today, given that you were kind of iterating in this problem space while it was in stealth mode? But it sounds like it was a pretty similar vision the whole time. Is that right?
I mean, we've had the vision to solve this IoT security problem in one way or another. And we always knew that we were going to look inside of the devices and look at the firmware and analyze that, find vulnerabilities. The way we've delivered that and the types of customers we've engaged with has changed quite a bit. We actually, for the first 2 years of the company, we were building a network appliance that would monitor the network and figure out what the inventory was, and then give you risk information based upon that. And one of the things that we realized after some time is we were spreading ourselves too thin. We were trying to solve too many problems at the same time, and we wound up, walking away from that piece of the business and focusing much more acutely on the supply chain security problem and doing really deep analysis of software and firmware, because that was what we were really uniquely good at, and the severity of those issues was increasing. The visibility in the market was increasing, and we found some really good customers, some segments of the market that really needed that, and we could focus, and that was a very important step that we took a little over a year ago.
Gotcha. So you went from stealth mode, and I guess it must have been about a year ago. I'm not exactly sure on the timeline, but the first time I actually noticed Finite State, it had this national news story with you did this analysis on Huawei. How different is that to be like to go from stealth mode to having a national news story about you? I guess, did that change the way you were operating at all?
Yeah, no, that was kind of a crazy thing to do as a startup. I can't explain it any other way. We decided to pick a fight with one of the biggest companies on the planet in the middle of a giant political battle between the U.S. government and the Chinese government, and we try to do that very reasonably and rationally, and provide data to a conversation. But we knew that the result was going to be that the Chinese government and Huawei were going to be very upset with the report that we put out. We had a lot of conversations as a board and as a team, as an early stage company, about whether we wanted to do that or not. And so that was, effectively how we came out of stealth mode. Was we looked at this global, conversation that was happening around 5G networks. For those of you that don't know, there's all of these concerns around the next generation of cellular networks. We have 4G now. Verizon's rolling out 5G. A handful of other telcos are rolling it out, and they're rolling it out around the world. And it turned out that the number one supplier of 5G equipment in the world is a Chinese company called Huawei, who's very closely affiliated with the Chinese government. And there's a lot of concerns from governments around the world that the Chinese government would install backdoors in those networks, and then, should they want to, at some point in the future, they could just turn them off, or they could perform mass surveillance, or they could manipulate things and cause national security problems. And so because we had this technology, we just took the firmware from 10,000 of their software packages of their products, and we analyzed it, and we were able to find backdoors. We were able to find major vulnerabilities that we didn't have to have a back and forth anymore. We could say with data, prove it and show the lines of code that had the problems in it. We were able to add data to a conversation that was lacking in data. And so it was picked up by the Wall Street Journal first. It was republished, I think, in about 50 countries. And I got my first experience on major TV, and was interviewed by a lot of different outlets, because we were the only ones that were able to do that. There was no other firm, no other government was able to provide that level of analysis. And up until that point in time, it was just finger pointing. The US government was saying, no, you're definitely going to put backdoors in the equipment. And the Chinese government and Huawei were saying, we would never do such a thing. That's ridiculous. And so we were able to prove things and provide a framework for how countries should measure their risk around these sorts of decisions.
Given that you were, to put it crudely, pissing off a giant, did you ever worry about threats to your own safety or anything like that?
You know, it was a slight concern. It in general, that's we kind of looked at that, and I have a lot of friends, let's say, in the government in different places, and so we kind of tried to make sure we understood the risks of what we were doing before that, and then there were people watching out should anything happen. The reality is it was very unlikely, think about it this way. So if we put a report out on Huawei, and then, a few days later, the CEO of that company dies mysteriously, that's all of a sudden going to put a lot more credibility into that report, because they were mad enough that something like that would happen. So it was really unlikely that they would do that. That's not the way that they would operate typically. We were very concerned that the Chinese government might hack us and try to discredit us, but we also had a very good team on that to make sure that we would detect it quickly if it happened, and we worked to prevent it. And so, I wasn't concerned that anyone was going to off me.
So in other words, you're like James Bond or something. You're just cool and collected.
No. Far from it. I'm sure any of my employees who are here would probably not compare me to cool, collected James Bond. But no, it's we were doing some pretty serious things that have serious consequences, but at the same time, that's they're not going to take it out on us necessarily in the way that you would think, and despite the fact that we do some pretty important work, we still find ways to have a good time while we're doing it.
That's interesting, especially now that we're in the world of COVID. And I feel like people have asked this question a number of times, but I'm curious, just, being 3 years into a company, how do you think about maintaining culture and that sort of stuff, given the sensitive nature of what you work on, and also now we're in like a pandemic. So has that changed the way you think about company culture at all?
Definitely. I mean, it's hugely different. When we started off as a completely Columbus-based in-person company, and we were doing, company happy hours all the time, and going out and socializing with each other, and we had an office that was fun, and we had a bar in it, all sorts of stuff like that. The startup in-office experience, and overnight that was gone. And I think being a distributed company, you kind of evolve a different type of culture, and it's generally in normal times you can make some trade-offs, and you can do things like get together in person periodically, and have offsites and things, or have corporate travel, and you can make up for the loss of the social side of being in a startup. And it's really important when you're in a startup to have that social experience, because everyone's working really hard, and it's important to remember that you're working with other human beings, and you see each other outside of a work context. It is incredibly difficult to do that today. There are no corporate offsites right now. There is no periodically let's get together and build those relationships, and so it's a night and day difference. But you can find ways to at least substitute to an extent. And we have some great people in the company that work really hard to make sure that we take breaks, and we have social activities and virtual happy hours and games. We have we're doing a really fun kind of virtual holiday party this Friday. We even have a white elephant that we're doing virtually. So you have to find new ways to engage, but it's still hard. The culture definitely is different. It becomes a lot more about getting work done, and then everyone kind of does their own thing. It's just a little bit less playful, I would say, than it probably is when you're in person.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super interesting. So, um, I guess like where would you say how big is the company today in terms of employees? Like are you raising again? Where are you at in terms of sort of the roadmap?
Yeah, so we closed our Series A round in March, and today we are 33 people. So like you said earlier, we've raised about $19.5 million so far, and so we have a good amount of runway in front of us. We probably don't need to raise again for at least another year. And the more customers we bring on, the longer we can go without raising again in general. And things are going really well. We have good traction in the market, and good prospects in front of us. So we're going to keep growing. We have really good really good opportunities. There's a lot of market factors that are in moving in the right direction for us to be very successful. And then we'll raise again when we need more capital to scale faster.
Gotcha. So I'm gonna ask this sort of as my last question. I don't know if folks will have questions. We covered a lot, and now I'm realizing we're coming up close to sort of the end here. But I always love to ask this to founders, and that is sort of how do you think the Columbus community and the more broader community of entrepreneurs that come to Startup Grind can help advance what you're doing? Is there anything that you think the community could be doing to support what you're working on?
Oh, that's really, really good question. I think, probably first and foremost, if you know good people who, you think would fit, want to work on the sorts of problems that we're working on, let us know. We're hiring a lot right now. And that's across engineering, product, sales, marketing. Really, across the board, we're hiring a lot, and it's really important to us that we find and bring together the best people in the world for the problem that we're solving. And we actually have really spent, despite being Columbus based, I think at this point we have more people outside of Columbus now than we have in Columbus, because we've moved to a completely distributed team. And we've even had some of our Columbus folks move away from Columbus because they felt the freedom to do that. One is living it up in Arizona right now, in the nice warm weather, while we're all suffering in the winter here. But that's the number one thing is, if there are people who you think would be a good fit, let us know, have them apply. We'll look through that. I aside from that, I think for me, what's been really great to see in my time in Columbus, and it's scary to think I'm coming up on almost 20 years of being in Columbus, just having a vibrant entrepreneurial community is a huge deal. It's grown. It grows every day. When you think back to 10 years ago, what startups were in Columbus compared to what there is today, I mean, it's a night and day difference. So keep doing that. Keep pushing forward, and building that, and that attracts more talent. It attracts more investment, and you'll see, it's just snowballing, and it's really exciting to watch.
Awesome. Well, I think we have time for one or two questions here. Warner, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Why not? Thanks for presenting, Matt. I enjoyed hearing some of your founder story. Security is a super crowded space, and even those who are creating value are having trouble differentiating What's your target market, and how do you think you'll get meaningful traction in that space?
Yeah, I think, if you look at security broadly, it can be really crowded. You go to the RSA conference and walk the hall, and you'll see it's very crowded. But there are problems. I think what's good about cybersecurity, and bad, but let's call it an opportunity, is that it's not solved. It's not solved by any stretch of the imagination. Attackers are getting more sophisticated. The risk is really asymmetric, and there's a lot of room for good solutions. I've been honestly very surprised, pleasantly surprised at how open many companies are to working with a startup, because they're hoping for someone who can really solve their problems and really listens to them, compared to what a lot of the bigger vendors do. So I think, to answer your question more directly, our target market we actually have two. We sell to device manufacturers who are building products. We sell into their product security organizations, and we help them build secure products. We integrate into their development processes, and we find vulnerabilities as part of the DevOps process, and we let them know, and they can fix them. We also help them respond to vulnerabilities after they've been discovered, so they can figure out where in their portfolio of products they've been impacted. And then separately, we work with what we call asset owners, people who buy those devices and put them on their networks. We've been very focused on the energy sector, because there's a regulatory driver there for needing to verify the integrity of software on those networks. We also work in the government sector for the same reason. There's some laws and regulations that are driving the demand for that. And so we feel very good about our traction and prospects going forward, because we are really differentiated in how we solve that problem. There really are not a whole lot of competitors in that space. Not to say that there won't be at some point, but we certainly feel like we have a first mover advantage and some really good regulatory headwinds that are driving a lot of business our way.
Columbus has been really fortunate to have some unicorn type activity over the last year or so, or a couple years. Is that sort of the direction you think you will go as Finite State?
Well, I certainly hope so. I think everyone that gets into it hopes for that. When you look at the cybersecurity space, the exits and IPOs, they're all over the place, and it just depends. It's really hard to predict. When we hire new people, sometimes they ask me, what's your exit strategy? Are we going to sell? Are we going to IPO? And the truth is, if I could predict the future at that level, I would be a very, very successful investor. It's very hard to say. It's very hard to know what path we're going to go down. I hope that we become very big. I hope that we can really fulfill our mission and really solve this really hard problem at large scale for a lot of people. I don't know what that will look like over the next several years. It's hard to say, but we'll see.
Fair enough. So Alan Files, I think you had a question for Matt.
Yeah. So with cybersecurity engineers being kind of a new thing, I feel like it's probably hard to hire them. And since you've had this experience kind of growing people into this role, are you guys, do you find it easier to take an engineer and turn them into a cybersecurity engineer, or, do you have your lookout for cyber engineers and that's easier to come by, or kind of how do you solve that personnel problem?
Really good question. Yeah, they don't teach it in school very often, as it turns out. And like many different niche fields that we've probably all worked in different ways. So we hire people with a lot of different backgrounds. We do that on purpose. I think, having different perspectives, whether you've worked in like the gaming industry or in consumer tech or, distributed systems, or you're a reverse engineer who's been looking at malware for the past 10 years. bringing all of those things together is really important. It makes us innovative. For people that we're hiring, usually we're going to err on the side of making sure that they have the skills that we're looking for in, do they understand the tech stack that we're working in? Do they understand the fundamentals of distributed systems, or, we're in AWS? Do they understand how to work in that environment for an engineer? More than, do they understand supply chain security and reverse engineering and firmware? We have a lot of people that can help teach you that once you get into the company. Now, on the flip side, if we're hiring a product manager, it's a lot more important that they understand firmware and they understand the problem that we're solving and the pain that product security teams are feeling every day as they're trying to build secure products. And so it just varies role to role what we're looking for. But in engineering, in particular, we're happy to take great engineers who are excited about what we're doing and passionate, driven by that mission, and teach them along the way.
With such a complex solution, well, I shouldn't call your solution complex, but with a problem such as this, like, how do you really think about going to market? What is the go-to-market strategy, if you will?
So, there's a lot of different aspects to a go-to-market strategy. One, for us, we're kind of in some ways, we're a little bit new category, a little bit new technology, at least for the problems that we're solving. This kind of deep firmware analysis and automation and solving, finding these vulnerabilities in embedded systems is new. And so we have to do a lot of education of the market, and people need to trust us and the expertise that we have. And so you'll see, if you look at our website, if you look at the sort of content that we put out, we try to make it expert driven, and we try to provide thought leadership around these problem sets that people are grappling with. Oftentimes, our customers don't even know it's possible to do what we do. We need to convince them that it's possible first, and then they say, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. Well, if I can do that, now I can find budget for that, because I didn't even know that I could put that in my budget to begin with. And so that's usually where we are. Now, the other side of it is the regulatory driven side, where the regulation comes down, the regulation creates budget, and then they need to figure out what to spend it on. And then we're there for that too. And we just need to find the right motivated customers on that side. But cybersecurity is one of those things that does tend to be a little bit reactionary as well. So we, when you see major events like what happened with SolarWinds, that will probably drive more buying behavior for supply chain security. Actually, I kind of hope it's a wake-up moment for a lot of the critical infrastructure in governments, because they haven't really been doing enough to take that threat seriously. And I think now it's very tangible, and that should lead to more funding and more R&D and more companies like us standing up to go solve it.
Awesome. Well, I think that is a good place to end it. Once again, thank you so much for coming out and sharing your story. Thank you for bearing with the technical difficulties there for a minute. And yay, everybody give a nice round of applause. See lots of hands clapping. But yeah, thank you, Matt. It was great to talk with you. And yeah, let us know if we can help you in any way. You're always welcome back as well.
Thank you, Lucas, and thank you all for spending the time here with me this evening. Really great questions. And if you have anything, feel free to reach out to me. You can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, or through our website. Happy to talk more.